For lockers were emptied that night. Not slowly. Not quietly. Not in the way organizations usually do things when they want to pretend nothing has changed. For lockers, for sets of uniforms, for names crossed off the roster in one swift movement. And at the center of it all stood Dave Roberts, a manager who had just watched his team lose, and who had apparently decided that losing was no longer something he was willing to accept in silence. This was not a regular roster move. This was a message. The Dodgers had lost. That alone would have been enough to create tension in the clubhouse. But the loss was not what made this night different from every other difficult night in a long season. What made this night different was what happened after the final out was recorded. What made this night different was the decision that came down from Roberts, fast, clean, and without room for argument. Sheehan was gone. 3 other pitchers were gone. DFA, designated for assignment. The baseball term that turns players into transactions. The term that means, you were here, and now you are not. 4 men. 4 lockers stripped bare. To understand what Roberts did, you first have to understand the game that preceded it. The Dodgers had lost. And in Roberts' mind, they had lost in a specific way, a way that had a specific cause. The pitchers who had been trusted with critical innings had not held. The bullpen had frayed at exactly the wrong moment. The kind of loss that doesn't happen because the other team was simply better. It happened because the Dodgers' own pitching staff had handed it to them. Roberts had watched it unfold from the dugout. Pitch by pitch. Out by out. The kind of watching that builds something quiet and heavy inside a manager, something that doesn't fully take shape until the final out lands and the stadium empties and the silence of the clubhouse replaces the noise of the game. By the time the Dodgers clubhouse door opened to the media, the decision had already been made. 4 lockers. 4 uniforms. Gone. The press conference room had a particular weight to it that night. The kind of weight that comes not from a single dramatic statement, but from the accumulation of everything left unsaid. Roberts walked in with the look of a man who had already finished the argument in his own head. There was no visible anger. No clenched jaw. No raised voice. There was only the quiet certainty of someone who had made a decision and was no longer questioning it. A reporter asked the obvious question. What happened tonight? Roberts paused. Not the pause of someone searching for words. The pause of someone deciding which words were worth using. We didn't pitch well enough. And I wasn't willing to move forward as if that was acceptable. The room absorbed that. Another reporter followed up, 4 pitchers, all at once. Was that the plan going in, or did it happen in the moment? Roberts placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. His voice stayed level. It wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. There's a difference. But then, before the press conference could settle into the rhythm of a manager explaining a difficult night, something shifted. The name Sheehan came up. Not in the context of the DFA. In the context of what happened after it. Because Sheehan had not gone quietly. The details moved through the building in the way that only details in a professional sports clubhouse can move, fast, fragmented, and impossible to fully contain. Sheehan, informed of his designation, had responded. Not with silence. Not with the kind of professional deflation that comes when a player understands the game well enough to know that the organization holds all the cards. Sheehan had spoken. And what he said pointed not at himself, but at someone else. Hatsatara. The name landed differently depending on who heard it. For those who had been watching the Dodgers closely, Hatsatara's struggles at the plate were not a secret. The numbers told a story that was difficult to read without a certain amount of discomfort, a hitter who had been given opportunity after opportunity, and who had returned those opportunities with silence. No production. A lineup spot that was costing the Dodgers something real, something measurable, in games that were growing more important by the week. Sheehan's argument, reduced to its plainest form, was this: if accountability is the standard, then accountability should apply to everyone. If 4 pitchers could lose their lockers for what happened on the mound, then a hitter who continued to produce nothing at the plate should face the same scrutiny. It was, by any measure, not the kind of argument you make when you are trying to leave quietly. It was the kind of argument you make when you have decided that quiet is not something you are willing to be. The clubhouse absorbed Sheehan's words the way clubhouses absorb everything, with a tension that doesn't fully show itself on the surface, but that everyone inside the room can feel pressing against the walls. The 4 lockers were already empty by then. The uniforms were already gone. And now there was something else in the air, a question that the DFA had raised without fully answering. Where exactly was the line? What was the standard? And if Sheehan was right, if the same accountability that cleared 4 pitchers off the roster should apply equally to a hitter who was costing the team runs in a different way, then what came next? Roberts was asked about it directly. He didn't deflect. He didn't pivot. He sat with the question for a moment, then answered in the way that he had answered everything else that night, with the flatness of a man who had already done his thinking before he walked into the room. Every player on this roster is evaluated. Every player. That's not new. He paused again. Tonight was about pitching. That doesn't mean other evaluations aren't happening. The second surprise of the night came in the form of an announcement that had not been expected. Relief reinforcements. While the locker cleanouts were still being processed, while the baseball world was still parsing what the DFA meant for Sheehan and the 3 others, still absorbing Sheehan's words about Hatsatera, the Dodgers made it known that help was coming. The bullpen that had just been stripped down was not going to be left in that condition. Roberts and the front office had moved simultaneously, removing what wasn't working, and reaching for what might. The names had not yet fully surfaced by the time the press conference ended. But the signal was clear. This was not a night of subtraction alone. From the outside, it was easy to read the evening as chaos. 4 men designated. One of them publicly pointing at a teammate. A surprise announcement of incoming pitching. The kind of night that, in a different organization under a different manager, might suggest a team coming apart at its seams. But the Dodgers under Roberts had never been particularly easy to read from the outside. What looked like chaos from a distance had a different texture up close. The DFA was not a panic move. It was a calibrated one. The threshold had been established, this is what we expect, and this is what happens when it isn't met, and then it had been applied. Cleanly. Quickly. Without the kind of organizational hand-wringing that turns a roster decision into a week-long conversation. 4 lockers. 1 night. Move forward. The harder question, the one that Sheehan's words made impossible to ignore, was whether the same standard could hold across different positions, different roles, different types of failure. A pitcher who gives up runs can be charted on a graph. The damage is visible in real time, tracked in pitch counts and exit velocities and final scores. But a hitter who goes 0 for 4 carries that number forward into a season's worth of context, a slump that might be a slump, or might be something more permanent, or might be the beginning of an adjustment that hasn't fully taken shape yet. Sheehan knew that distinction. He raised the name anyway. Which meant that whatever he was expressing in that moment was not a calculated argument about evaluation standards. It was something more human than that. It was the frustration of a man who had just lost something real, his place on the roster, his uniform, his locker, and who looked around the clubhouse and saw a version of failure that was being treated differently from his own. Whether he was right or wrong almost didn't matter. He had said what he said. And now everyone inside the organization, including Hatsatera, had to live inside those words. The lockers stayed empty through the rest of the night. By the time the last reporters had filed their stories and the clubhouse had gone quiet, the Dodgers had already moved past the moment in the way that professional sports teams always move past moments, by preparing for the next game, the next series, the next decision that would need to be made. The reinforcements were coming. The roster was being rebuilt in real time. And Dave Roberts, in the press conference room, had already said everything he intended to say. He answered one final question, about whether nights like this one were the hardest part of managing, with a response that was shorter than everything else he had said, and somehow heavier than all of it. This job requires you to make the decision and then live with it. The living with it is the hard part. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. For Lockers had already said the rest.